friends from the NGO community, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to this first roundtable of this historic conference. A roundtable on the right to accessible, safe, and inclusive learning spaces. As you heard this morning, education can make or break individuals and societies. In the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, this Sustainable Development Goal, number 4, really is the cornerstone making other goals possible. 1 and 2 on poverty and hunger, 3 on health, then 5 on gender, 6 on water and sanitation, going through to energy on 7. SDG 8 on employment. How is it possible to get a decent job if you do not have a good education? We move through the SDGs to ones on infrastructure, on settlements, on resources, on the environment. There's a critical SDG in the middle of those, SDG 10 on reducing inequality. And it ends with SDGs 16 and 17, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, and also looking at the means of implementation and partnerships. Without global citizenship education, it is not possible to achieve these things. Without understanding, without dialogue. So in this context, our roundtable will look at ways in which nobody will be left behind. We're going to consider barriers to education. Some of the most significant barriers are socio-cultural, but there are many other barriers, physical barriers, barriers related to information, which are also very relevant. So our aim is to come forth with a series of recommended, concrete, formal actions to ensure everybody has an opportunity to learn and grow, to reach their potential, as indicated in SDG 4. We will also consider informal approaches, such as training and mentoring, and we will consider social mobilization, awareness raising, public-private partnerships, and other actions and modalities to reduce quality gaps in education. So to begin, it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Myungsook Cho, who is the Vice Principal of the Yeomyung School of North Korean Defectors. Ms. Cho.
예, 안녕하십니까. 이 자리에 오게 돼서 너무 기쁘고요. 저는 저의 얘기를 좀 하고 싶습니다. 저는 탈북 청소년들을 가리키는 여명학교의 조명숙 교감입니다. 저는 빈민촌에서 태어나고 자랐습니다. 제가 선택하지 않은 가난으로 너무 고생을 하다 보니 어린 시절 제 안에는 분노가 쌓이기 시작했습니다. 상대적으로 너무 가난하고 고난을 겪게 되면 분노가 쌓이는 것 같습니다. 그럴 즈음에 담임 선생님께서 가정 방문을 하셨습니다. 방 한 칸에 6명이 살고 있는 것을 보셨음에도 선생님께서는 명숙이가 잘 배워 성장하면 반드시 다른 사람들을 도와줄 것입니다. 힘드시더라도 꼭 가르치세요 라고 부모님을 설득하셨습니다. 선생님은 가난한 사람도 의미 있게 살고 싶다는 것을 아셨던 것 같습니다. 저는 선생님이 너무 감사했고 선생님 말씀처럼 공부해서 다른 사람들을 정말 돕고 싶었습니다. 그래서 저와 같은 빈민촌의 아이들을 가르치는 교사가 되기로 하였습니다. 대학에 진학하여 예비교사로 공부하는 중에 우연히 가난한 나라에서 온 외국인 노동자를 만나게 되었습니다. 시급하게 도와야 하는 사람들 앞에서 교사의 꿈을 내려놓고 23살에 외국인 노동자를 돕는 NGO 운동가가 되었습니다. 그러다 중국에서 탈북 난민들을 만나게 되고 저보다 외국인 노동자보다 더 어려운 그들을 돕게 되었습니다. 그래서 목숨을 걸고 같이 국경을 넘는 일도 하였습니다. 남한에서는 북한 이탈 주민의 사회 정착을 돕는 일을 하게 되었습니다. 이러한 과정을 겪으면서 사회에서 가장 낮은 사람들의 환경을 개선해주고 제도를 개선해주면 그들의 형편이 올라가면 그 위에 계층 사람들은 자연스럽게 더 좋아진다라는 것을 배우게 되었습니다. 10여 년 이상 사회 문제를 풀고 제도를 개선하였지만 보다 근본적인 대안을 만들고 싶어졌습니다. 그리고 그것이 사람을 키우는 일이라고 생각했습니다. 사회 각 분야에서 NGO의 마인드를 가진 사람들을 키워내는 것이 중요하다고 생각했습니다. 고난을 겪는 사람들이 스스로 성장하도록 도와야겠다는 생각을 하고, 그리고 곧 다가올 통일 시대를 위해 또 사회에서 가장 어려운 계층인 탈북 청소년들을 돕고 싶었습니다. 그들에게 희망을 만들어내고 싶어서 대안학교를 운영하였습니다. 제가 가르치는 탈북 학생들도 어려서의 저처럼 자신이 선택하지 않은 것들, 즉 북한에서 태어났다는 것만으로 너무 많은 것을 겪어낸 학생들입니다. 그들은 북한에서 외면당하고 남한에서 소외되었다고 생각했으며 이러한 과정에서 부모조차도 자녀들의 보호자가 될 수 없었습니다. 그래서 그 탈북 청소년들은 분노와 미래에 대한 불안감이 가득했습니다. 이러한 탈북 청소년들의 문제는 제도를 개선하고 환경을 지원해 준다고 풀리는 문제가 아닙니다. 이들을 격려하고 이들을 지지하며 인간적인 상처가 있는 학생들은 인간적으로 품어야 하며 그 상처가 분노로 폭발되지 않고 성장 동력이 되도록 가르쳐야 했습니다. 그리고 제가 만난 탈북 청소년들을 통해 저는 NGO 활동가로서 그들의 제도의 결함을 보면 제도를 바꿔냈고, 환경의 개선이 필요하면 그것도 바꿔내려고 노력하였으며, 사회의 문제라면 사람의 문제라면 교육을 하였습니다. 저에게 배운 탈북 청소년들이 삶의 각 분야에서 사회를 변화시키는 경험을 하고 또 그 증인이 되고 더 나아가 사회를 발전시키는 꿈을 갖게 하려고 노력하였습니다. 그것이 제가 그들을 교육하면서 돕는 이유입니다. 이제 우리는 국경이 모호한 시대에 살고 있습니다. 저희 NGO도 그래야 할 것 같습니다. NGO의 경계를 넓혀 각 영역에서 NGO의 마인드를 가진 사회 변혁가들을 키워내는 일에 집중할 때라고 생각합니다. 지금 한반도에는 통일이라는 숙제를 안고 있습니다. NGO가 없는 북한, 또 강압적이고 통제적인 대상과 미래를 함께 생존해야 하는 작지 않은 숙제를 가지고 있습니다. 저는 우리의 사회 통합을 위해서 가장 낮고 소외되고 배려받지 못하는 이제는 탈북 청소년들을 가르치고 그들 스스로 설 수 있도록 하면서 미래의 통일 시대를 준비하는 것이 우리의 숙제라고 생각합니다. 제가 경험한 바로는 가장 어려운 사람들에겐 가장 제대로 된 교육이 들어가야 된다고 생각합니다. 그것을 위해 에너지를 모으고 그랬을 때 사회는 자연스럽게 변화되고 더 발전될 것이라고 생각합니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cho. Very inspiring words. We now move to His Excellency Omrie Golley, who is the Ambassador of Sierra Leone to the Republic of Korea. Your Excellency.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to bring you greetings from our President, Dr. Ernest Bai Koroma, and the government and people of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and to speak briefly at this very important, worthy event on the importance of education, dealing with the important and in my humble opinion, inalienable right to inclusive, safe, and accessible learning spaces. Ladies and gentlemen, education is about developing a nation's human capital. Human capital, in my view, is the most important and fundamental factor of development, which affects any developing country's economic future. Sierra Leone, like all other developing countries, would not be able to achieve sustainable economic development without a substantial investment in her human capital. Education, therefore, is critical in every sense of the word. It is critical in increasing and advancing productivity, in securing economic and social progress, and improving income distribution, as well as reducing poverty and inequality. It equips individuals with the tools that could help them tap into their creative minds. It promotes entrepreneurship and technological advancement, and this in turn enriches society's understanding of themselves and the world in which we live. My country, Sierra Leone, has been at the pinnacle of the advancement of education in West Africa, and has also sadly experienced how war and the advent of the Ebola virus disease have had a consequential negative downturn in our overall educational output and human development. Over 2 centuries ago, with the founding of Furo Bay College in 1827, Sierra Leone was the center of Western-style education in sub-Saharan Africa. At this time, major institutions of higher learning in the world, such as the London School of Economics and Political Science, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Stanford University were not yet founded. Educated Sierra Leoneans were sent to neighboring countries like Ghana, Gambia, Nigeria, and Cameroon to serve as administrators, clerks, and similar positions that required the services of trained and educated professionals. Unfortunately, our country faced its own challenges of political and social development from the late 1960s up to the late 80s in particular, and then from 1992 to 2001 with a devastating civil war that had a very harmful and negative effect on our national economy, and as a consequence, on our education policy and educational achievements. Our country recovered from these blights on our national development efforts, as Sierra Leone registered one of the most impressive economic indicators from 2007 onwards, with the highlight of our national development efforts being achieved in 2013, with a GDP growth rate of around 16%. Then Ebola struck in the early part of 2014, affecting the Mana River Union countries of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. This very unfortunate event resulted in the loss of over 11,000 lives and a massive downturn in the economic achievements of the previous decade. Education in our country was severely hit, with many deaths being recorded among school-going and college students, and the closure of all educational centers throughout the country. Ebola now, thankfully, has been defeated in our sub-region. And with the demise of this unfortunate event, a renewed determination by my government to place education at the top of its national objectives and priorities. The right to inclusive, safe, and accessible learning spaces remain a key component of my country's educational policy. Socioeconomic factors, however, continue to be a challenge to the service delivery of education in developing countries, my country included, and as a consequence on our national human and economic development. These include urbanization, problems with adult literacy, fertility, infant mortality, malaria, poverty, and other factors. And whilst efforts continue to be made by governments in developing countries in combating these negative socio-economic factors, sadly, as long as these factors remain, there will continue to be a challenge to our ultimate noble goal of value in education as a whole, and particularly the right to inclusive, safe, and accessible learning spaces. I thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Golley. Next on our panel is Dr. Chaechun Gim, who is the president of the Korean Education Development Institute. Dr. Gim.
We are here at the Roundtable to talk about quality education for all, but it is quite a complicated issue to talk for short 5 minutes assigned to me. So I will focus on 3 specific cases to trigger more discussion. First, despite the great progress made by the EFA movement, there are still many children who don't have basic education opportunities, such as out-of-school children, migrated children, and so on. So we have to think of some strategies which will lead to ensure quality learning spaces for all. As one of the strategies we can mobilize to enhance accessibility, I'd like to suggest establishing open schools of distance learning, where blended learning is implemented. In Korea, we have more than 40 years of experience in running open schools at the level of secondary education. As of 2016, KEDI, Korean Educational Development Institute, which I belong to, runs 20 middle schools and 42 high schools of distance learning, educating around 14,000 students. As many of you know, secondary education in Korea became universal in the early 1990s. However, there are still many adults who didn't have the chance to attend the secondary schools in the youth. That's why we launched open secondary schools for the elderly generation left behind. With the development of ICT technology, e-learning or cyber learning has become very effective and convenient than traditional education, and it can be implemented at a moderate price. Second, with regard to safety and health issues in education, girls have become the primary concern of ours. For example, schools without toilets or lack of hygiene-related products are one of the causes which serve to increase the rate of girls' absenteeism or to lower educational performance of girls. That's why we have to work on the issue of safe and healthy learning spaces for girls. Last September, the President of the Republic of Korea presented a Better Life for Girls initiative at the UN Sustainable Development Summit. The initiative plans to donate $200 million over the next 5 years for girls living in 7 developing countries located in Asia and Africa. As part of the initiative, KEDI is willing to work together with many institutes in Cambodia and Myanmar. The 3 key areas we have interest in are girls' right to education, healthy schools for girls, and girls' right to profession. I hope that today's talk in the roundtable would be helpful in developing the project. Finally, the last topic I will talk about is inclusiveness. Recently, we are witnessing a growing polarization around the world. We are also suffering from many global problems such as terrorism, climate change, nuclear weapons, xenophobia, and so on. In an age of global village, global citizenship equation is no longer optional. It is a necessity. To save the earth and ensure our safe life on it, GCED, global citizenship equation, is one of the most influential strategies we can mobilize. Through GCED, we can teach future generations not only to tolerate difference, but also to make new solutions by engaging in difference. We should also teach future generations the importance of difference over identity by emphasizing that pursuit of identity tends to result in discrimination. APSEU, Asia Pacific Center of Education for International Understanding, one of the UNESCO-affiliated institutes based in Korea, has provided capacity building workshops to foster GCED lead teachers and conducted joint projects to develop GCED curriculum with developing countries. I think that the importance of GCED cannot be overemphasized in cultivating a sense of global community or a global community of difference. I hope that this roundtable will become a benchmark, a landmark, will bring about fruitful and substantial changes in quality for education. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Gim. I now have the pleasure of inviting Ms. Daniela Bas, the Director of the Division for Social Policy and Development of UN DESA. Ms. Bas.
Good afternoon. This is a way of greeting from people who cannot hear. I hope that next time, in order to educate everybody, there will be also people who interpret with sign language. So to leave no one behind. With this, I want to say that there are 1 billion people that my division has the honor to serve. For 100 million people, my division has the honor to serve. 900 million people, my division has the honor to serve. And I could go on and on. What I'm talking about here is groups so-called of vulnerable groups. Older people, youth, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and the family. These are all in the division I had the honor to lead. We have been tasked to serve the whole United Nations system on these groups. I know you already had the honor to hear the envoy of the Secretary General on Youth. We have also other envoys on disability, etc., but today I know that the focus is on youth and education. Allow me, though, to say that I would like to expand the meaning of education, that it is not only in schools. We learn also in our families, values and culture, and that's also part of being educated. We have also other very important means that can share with us or through us, or we through them, education. Education to become citizens, active actors, active agents of change, etc., through the media, radio, television, cinema, and technologies. That's also part of having access to other parts of what communities do. Now, what I wanted to say is that when we talk about education, therefore, let's not focus only on formal education, but also informal education. And when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about having access to education, whatever forms of education we want to talk about. We have to have access to that education through infrastructures, schools, theaters, or other venues where we meet to share our knowledge and learn from the knowledge of others. They have to be barrier-free, no architectural barriers, no stairs, no ramps. They have to be accessible to people who cannot see, who cannot hear, who cannot walk properly. And this can be a young person, an older person, or some members and friends we have in our families. To leave no one behind. Leaving no one behind when it comes to education, and therefore having access to education, implies also taking care of those people who live in rural areas. Let's think about young people who live in rural areas. And the world is becoming more and more urbanized. People move towards cities. What happens to those young people who live in rural areas if transportation is not accessible to reach schools in cities? Accessible also in terms of costs. Paying for transportation costs money. What about those people who, either to have access to employment or other forms of education, cannot utilize transportation? If you have a disability, it may be difficult. If you don't have money, it's difficult. Therefore, education is a strategy. It's a key strategy to eradicate poverty. It's a key strategy to reduce the gap of inequalities. Key. So let's not think of education only in terms of school. Let's think of education in terms of sharing knowledge with the private sector, sharing knowledge with the people who govern us, politicians, sharing knowledge within the families, sharing knowledge with young, old people. Languages are very important. We have to keep in consideration also indigenous peoples, those 400 million people I was referring to at the beginning. They go to school, but maybe their language is not spoken. They cannot be educated. They cannot receive, not be educated. That's not what I want to say. They cannot receive the same kind of knowledge that others can. One language every 2 weeks dies. I'm talking about the languages of indigenous peoples. 1 billion people in the world have some kind of disability. So unless we make everything accessible, information, communication, transportation, infrastructures, whatever, to include everybody in this beautiful world of learning and sharing, therefore being educated, we are not going to promote a world that is accessible, inclusive, sustainable, and therefore safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bas. We now turn to Mr. Bruce Knotts, who is the chair of the Executive Committee of Non-Governmental Organizations associated with the United Nations in the Department of Public Information. Mr. Knotts.
Thank you. This roundtable is about the importance and challenges of providing inclusive, supportive, and well-financed education for all. Many people are either explicitly denied or often more subtly pushed away from educational opportunities due to their gender, gender identity, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, age, ability or disability, or financial incapacity. Often there are instances of bullying, discrimination, microaggressions, or financial barriers which prevent people from participating in formal or informal education and advocacy. Parents with several children and of limited means often make a choice to send only one child to school. Often that child will be male, heterosexual, with no visible disabilities. Families often feel that such a choice offers the best chance for success for the family. Often that choice is a mistake. We want all learners to have the opportunity to learn and grow to their maximum potential. When allowed to do so, we are often surprised and delighted to find those with tremendous potential are different from our stereotypical wealthy, straight, white, athletic male student. We find gems of brilliance in women, LGBTI people, people of color, or someone like Stephen Hawking, who has multiple physical disabilities and may have the most brilliant mind on the planet. Or Michael Donald Kirby, an Australian jurist and academic who was a former justice of the High Court of Australia. He was appointed by the Human Rights Council to lead the inquiry into human rights abuses in North Korea. He's gay. Tim Cook, Apple CEO, is gay. Neil deGrasse Tyson, probably the most famous astronomer, is a person of color. Christine Lagarde is a woman and she manages the International Monetary Fund. Oprah Winfrey grew up very poor. She's a woman of color and probably one of the most influential and richest women in the world today. There's an interesting couple, husband and wife team, Do-Won Chang and Chin Suk, who founded Forever 21. Do-Won had to work 3 jobs at the same time to make ends meet, so he was very poor. They opened their first clothing store in 1984. Forever 21 now is an international chain with 480 stores, earning about $3 billion a year. None of these above people that I just mentioned are wealthy, straight, white, athletic male students. Imagine the global opportunities we can develop with inclusive, supportive, and fully financed education for all. We believe that education is critical to the achievement of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and that many people are effectively denied access to education due to poverty, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other factors. Even when policy states that education is open to all, bullying and harassment in learning spaces can make it difficult or impossible for children and adults to learn. When we asked the LGBTI people in Uganda what they needed more than anything else, we were surprised with the response. They said literacy. Asked why literacy, they responded that most of them were kicked out or bullied out of their school or their families and never allowed to complete their education. It's tough having to face life without adequate literacy skills. Mark Tewksbury, the gold medal winning Canadian Olympic swimmer, was kicked out of 4 high schools in Alberta because of his sexual orientation before he was able to combat bigotry through athletic prowess. And I just cite him as an example that even in more developed countries or so-called progressive countries, this kind of discrimination can exist. And I want to close with a reference to the good book by Reverend Peter Gomes, who's a former chaplain at Harvard. And he mentioned that the Bible was used to oppress people of color and justify slavery and torture. Later, it was used to also oppress women. And lately, it's been used to oppress people because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. These religious views change over time. And because these religious views change, we should not allow religion to be used to either include or exclude people. And we should include everybody because that's the best policy. Being different should not mean you are prevented from getting an education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knotts. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Robert Ogburn, who is Minister Counselor for Public Affairs of the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, Korea.
Great. Thank you very much, Marco. You know, President Obama has said that we all are true to our creed when a little girl born into the bleakest poverty knows that she has the same chance to succeed as anybody else. And it's a very exciting time to be here in Korea, especially after the very successful World Education Forum that was hosted in Incheon, Korea last year in the Incheon Declaration. And it's also wonderful to hear President Obama, when he reflects on Korea and its remarkable success, to especially single out education as one of the key factors for not only its economic success, but for democratization and all the prosperity that you see here today, whether in Gyeongju or other parts of Korea. But it makes it a little bit difficult for me personally because right before the session, Marco said, well, we were talking about problem areas. And of course, for myself, as a diplomat based in Korea, it's a little difficult to find true problem areas in such a wonderful education system here in Korea. And indeed, with Korea's sophisticated system, sophisticated and highly developed attitudes, I myself, as a practitioner of public diplomacy and educational exchange, need to be very creative and look for new areas as well. So I think that the main area that, for example, the US and a recently and remarkably well-developed country like Korea can do is be partners. Be partners not only to find areas that people who do not have access, whether in the US or Korea, can find ways to have better access, but also ways in which the US and Korea can help other less developed countries as well. For example, Director Kim mentioned the Better Life for Girls initiative, that wonderful multi-year, $200 million, very strategically designed initiative. There are a lot of intersections between that and Michelle Obama's Let Girls Learn initiative that is being administered by USAID. So we look for different ways, and one of the main areas that I try to stress, looking at the next generation of leaders in Korea, try to encourage, and I certainly do it from a point of modesty, is the value of failure, the value of succeeding through responsible risk-taking, and the value of creating institutions and a society that supports risk-taking, that supports slight detours in one's educational and career path, and that actually embraces it and publicly acknowledges it as a way to find better and more resilient success. Also, I believe that all of you are aware that the US education system is very, very decentralized compared to many other countries. The Department of Education is nowhere equivalent to the influence or power of, say, the Ministry of Education here in Korea. So often it's up to local governments and it's up to volunteers, it's up to very concerned parents and community leaders to help shape the education system in the US. Well, in the same way, it's also a bit of globalization for American diplomats who are posted to different countries to try to find ways that we can best address the needs. So having worked mostly in third world countries, it's very interesting to do that here in Korea. But some particular areas, for example, are reaching non-traditional audiences, such as North Korean refugees, as Ms. Jo has mentioned, such as reaching those who are physically or mentally challenged. And a lot of that comes out of a sense of humility and having speakers, having experts arranging for courses with Americans who talk about the long path that the US has taken to try to achieve equal access in education. So those are just a few of the issues that we're dealing with. And once again, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very, very distinguished roundtable.
Thank you, Mr. Ogburn. Last but not least, we have Ms. Rasheda Choudhury, who is the Vice President and CEO of the Global Campaign for Education, the Campaign for Popular Education.
Thank you. It's so wonderful again to be speaking here in front of this gathering. But this time we would like to listen to you more than we speaking. But whatever this is here, we are here. Thank you again. The topic of this roundtable's discussion is that education must be accessible to all throughout life through quality learning opportunities. Well, access to education is not exactly an opportunity. It's the right of every individual to get access to quality learning. That's where I would like to start as a non-negotiable principle. And governments has the obligation, they have the obligation. It is state responsibility to ensure that right to education accessible to all. Now coming back to the topic of our discussion, education, particularly in terms of global citizenship education, accessible, safe, inclusive learning spaces. What do we mean by these terms? Are we really clear about it? It's not this room. I'm talking about the global community. The communities at the grassroots level, whether our families, they know, whether they understand these terms, global citizenship education. And we have to keep in mind, in many of our countries, in the developing world, more than 30% of the school children, particularly if we talk about formal education, they are first generation learners. Their parents do not have any education. So they may have traditional wisdom, because we can't ignore that. They have all the knowledge they have, but no formal education. That's why I appreciate the reference by Madam to non-formal education. Now coming to the institutions. Are our institutions ready and equipped enough to deal with global citizenship education issues? Are our teachers well equipped to really have discussion among the students, particularly among the youth who are future leaders, to deal with global citizenship education issues? The other point, if it's a state responsibility to implement all the SDGs and this one, global citizenship education, whether our people can hold our governments accountable, and where do we stand in terms of getting all those together? Well, global citizenship education is there. It's a part of SDGs, but now what do we do? And I would really like to endorse or express solidarity with the Guangzhou Plan of Action. This is where many of these messages have come in, but we need to also look at the main focus of how do we hold our governments accountable, our public representative accountable. So there are elements here. So family, institutions, government, all the institutions of a state, how do we have a global citizenship education that will really make a society culturally vibrant, environmentally sustainable, economically viable, and socially just. And that's where we have to also learn from our communities. This is where I would like to end with just a story. One that because I work with the communities, grassroots communities, I have been learning from them a lot. When the SDGs were adopted, we were in the field actually talking to the people in courtyard meetings. You know, the microfinance groups, they have courtyard meetings. Whether they know all these things about global citizenship education, they know because they have been practicing peace tolerance. But when we ask them, do you have violence within your families? Are you beaten by your husbands? This is what happens in the developing world. And they didn't have any pretense. They said yes. Then we said, okay, fine, maybe global citizenship education, we could discuss later. Peace, tolerance, etc. Then I had to go back to that village after hearing a story. Once, a 25-year-old girl, a mother of one, she was expecting, but she was beaten mercilessly by her husband, and she was bleeding profusely. So she was taken to the hospital. But all the village women, they gathered together, and they went from door to the public representatives. Nobody listened to them. And then you know what they did? All the women in that coastal rural village of Bangladesh, they decided to go on for a no cooking strike. It was decided. And it's a fisherman's village. How could they do? Go to fishing, all these men without food. They continued it for 3 days. Then the village leaders, all the public representatives came back to them, apologized to them, and it has never happened in that village after that. So this is the people's power. And that's what global citizenship education means to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Choudhury. We've now heard from all of our speakers, and in our 90-minute session, we're halfway through. So we're going to have some interactions here among members of the panel, trying to look more at how to move forward, what kind of actions are necessary now that issues have been identified. Then we will leave some time at the end for some questions from the floor, and that will give opportunities to people to ask things that have been discussed, or also if you think there have been any omissions, if you want to ask a question, or if you have a concern which has not been addressed, that will be the opportunity. To begin our interaction, a whole series of issues have been raised. We've seen the issue of identity, issues of barriers, the need for key strategies, then this whole issue of education being an inalienable right, a non-negotiable principle. With that in mind, I'd like to go back to Ambassador Golley and ask him, in his experience in Sierra Leone, what are some of the key factors in looking forward, in driving forward in the context of education, and how can we bring civil society or NGOs into that fold?
Thank you very much. I think I can answer that question by going backwards in time to the Civil War time in my country, which was a very unfortunate time, 1992 to 2001, and the work of civil society, work of NGOs in various fields, not only in the political field, but insofar as education is concerned, some of the actions that were taken by women, for example, in terms of education, in terms of, it was a very difficult time in my country, and we were moving from the military sort of military dictatorship onto the period of democracy, when democracy actually took off. And you had a lot of situations where people were out in the streets and were organizing strikes to remove the government of the day, or the military government of the day, saying that enough was enough and we wanted democracy at the time. So NGOs played a very, very important part in the civil movement at that particular time, in marshalling support for various strategies in education, in sending the children to school, in making sure that the children were literally looked after, picked up, the most basic things, fed, to make sure that they went to school regardless of the difficulties that we were facing at the time. So NGOs played a very, very important part in at that particular time in my country's history. In the time of the Civil War as well, refugees, there were a lot of refugee issues. The movements, the NGO movements were wonderful in terms of the way that they ensured that the children still continue to have basic forms of education, etc. And that is why it's so good to involve NGOs, particularly in this drive. It's such an important aspect of what we are, what we are pushing forward, the ability of and getting the NGOs to be involved in some of these issues.
So effectively, there must have been the space for the NGOs to operate. There has to be a partnership with government in that context.
Well, yes, to a certain extent there was, but there was also a determination during the time of the military dictatorship moving on to the democratic movement. We were not going to allow, at the time, the government of that particular day, who, it was not particularly popular at the time, to prevent us from saying what we had to say and ensuring that life went on in terms of some of the basic needs of the population, particularly education.
Thank you. With that in mind, I'd like to ask Ms. Cho. We see here in the Republic of Korea, the government obviously has allowed that space for NGOs to operate. What can NGOs do with the government in partnership with other groups to increase that space to have greater impact?
예, 원래 정책은 뒤에 따라오는 거기 때문에 현장보다 뒤에 따라올 수밖에 없습니다. 그래서 그 모든 것들을 설득해내고 그다음에 정책을 다시 바꿔야 되는 게 NGO의 사명이고 역할인데요. 그 외국인 노동자가 처음에 들어왔을 때는 사실 노동자로서의 권리가 안 되었고 그다음에 탈북자가 왔을 때는 그냥 남한식으로 적응하라고 어떤 이런 부분들이 이분들한테 굉장히 어려움을 더 가중시키게 되었습니다. 그래서 저희 그 NGO에서는 이들의 고유한 개성과 특징을 좀 포함해서 좀 더 다른 이들에게 맞는 그런 교육 과정을 개설해야 된다. 처음에는 이제 약간의 이제 그 지원을 해주는 걸로 정부가 그 역할을 다 했다고 생각하고 있는 것 같았습니다. 그래서 계속 언론 작업도 하고 NGO들끼리 모아서 이게 얼마나 의미가 있는지, 그리고 북한 출신에게 남한 교육을 그냥 시키는 게 과연 옳은 것인가라는 근본적인 문제들을 계속 끊임없이 얘기를 해서 이 아까 이제 선생님들께서 앞에서 얘기했듯이 안전하고 포용 가능한 어떤 그런 틀이 굉장히 중요하다고 했는데, 사실 이제 많은 어려움을 겪은 사람, 불안정하고 굉장히 압박당한 사람한테는 안전하다는 느낌이 가장 중요했습니다. 그래서 이런 시설까지 불안정하면은 굉장히 더 어렵기 때문에 그런 부분들을 갖추려고 했고, 그 다음에 어떤 학력인가라는 학력을 인정받지 않으면 검정고시를 쳐야 되는데 그러면 이분들한테 중요한 심리적인 치유나 교육이 불가능했습니다. 그래서 탈북 청소년이나 아니면 그 외국인 그 노동자의 자녀나 이런 아이들을 교육하는 공간은 약간 수준이 낮더라도 그러니까 그 어떤 하드웨어를 잘 갖추지 못했을지라도 인가를 내주는 그렇게 제도를 변화하고 그걸 같이 협력해서 정부하고 얻어냈고 지금은 약간의 지원을 더 이렇게 만들어내는 역할까지 하게 되었습니다.
Thank you very much. That's very encouraging to hear. I'd like to now move to Ms. Choudhury because you also raised the issues of institutions which have just been mentioned. You were talking about institutions at the local level where civil society had a significant impact. How would you suggest those institutions or those experiences at that level can be scaled up? Can they be translated into other areas? Can systems be put in place?
Yeah, it's possible, but three things have to be kept in mind. One is the context, which is very important. Our contexts are different in different countries. And the commitment of the national government or local government or public representatives. We call it 3C, context, commitment, and the capacity. Capacity to deliver, capacity to understand, and capacity to monitor and help people. These are the things that are important if we really want to replicate or scale up. But these are already scaled up, as you know, through our microfinance mechanisms and NGOs in Bangladesh. These are already scaled up in many areas. But there could be South-South cooperation, as mentioned by the speakers this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, with that in mind, I would like to ask Ms. Bas what the UN can do to facilitate this process. Obviously, the UN is very committed to these things. It's often involved in capacity development. What else can it do more specifically to encourage civil society and governments to work together with other players?
Thank you. I would say the reverse. What can NGOs do for the United Nations? Some suggestions and ideas I do have, but I do really hope we will have time to have an interaction with the audience here. However, we see the United Nations has three main pillars, three very important columns that can support the roof of the world. One, the first one is peace and security. The second column is human rights. And the third one, where I work, is development. Development of policies and the norms in the economic, social, environmental, and cultural dimensions. Therefore, if the NGO community can follow the debate that is taking place at international level and translate it day by day at local and national level, I think that this is a partnership that needs to be strengthened. And though rights are very important, rights without strong social policy frameworks at national level, if these social policy frameworks are not put in existence at national level, rights cannot be implemented. They remain law, pieces of law written in books in the shelves. So the lady earlier on said, policy changes, action, and we need frameworks. I couldn't agree more. This is our role. So please, NGOs, share with us your experiences. Share with us what needs to be done. Share your knowledge with us. We will try then to elaborate your knowledge and share it in ways of providing advice to governments. That's my role. I have to listen to all stakeholders and translate what I hear into possible advice we give to governments through our mechanisms, internal mechanisms, one of which is called the Commission for Social Development that meets every February in the United Nations and gives advice to the Economic and Social Council that then elaborates our recommendations into the General Assembly of the UN, and member states, 193 member states there discuss, and they decide if our advice, our recommendations that include also your knowledge are acceptable or need to be elaborated. And then there, they decide if these recommendations can become resolutions, therefore mandates. So we need your support in this. And actually, later on, if you wish, we can discuss how we can together organize particular special events for the next Commission on Social Development in February 2017. Sorry it took long, but I really wanted to say this. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I think it's a very valid point. I mean, I'm also working in the UN system, and one thing we lack is good practices from civil society, clearly documented as good evidence that we can take to policymakers. So that is a partnership we need. With that in mind, and that brings us within the realm of global citizenship education, because we try to have a framework within which to work, I'd like to ask Dr. Gim how that framework, how it can work, and how we can at the same time promote identities, because there's a tension there. We have the Korean example of, you have the Korean identity you don't want to lose. How can you keep promoting global citizenship education in that context?
In the past in Korea, we tried to teach students to be proud that Korea is a one ethnic nation. But nowadays, we try to teach students from the perspective of multicultural education, because recently we have a growing population of international persons, multi-ethnic populations, about 2 million multi-ethnic populations in Korea, and we have more than 100,000 multi-ethnic students. So nowadays, we cannot say, oh, you should be proud of that we are one ethnic nation, because we have many multi-ethnic students. That's why in the past, we try to teach students on the basis of politics or community of identity, but nowadays, it cannot work anymore, because we have many multi-ethnic students, many multi-ethnic populations. That's why the government tried to, retrain teachers to teach students from the multicultural perspectives. But nowadays, still many, Korean populations are not accustomed to that kind of, new, paradigm of multicultural educations. So that's why we try to educate students and the population of all Korean citizens from the perspective of multicultural education, where we try to educate them, global citizenship education, try to see, everything from the multicultural perspectives. So actually, we are struggling with that kind of problem nowadays. That's it. Thank you.
You may be struggling, but at least there are policies, there are initiatives in place, and that's definitely a step in the right direction. With this in mind, I'd like to move to, or rather back to Mr. Ogburn. You too mentioned things about identity, but also responsibility in the context of risk-taking. It's a risk to go outside your comfort zone, and a comfort zone is often determined by your identity with a group. So what kind of values can be inculcated to encourage risk-taking, especially among young people? And what kind of structures can promote that?
Thank you very much, Marco. That's a great question. And as I was listening to the other panelists talk, it's a truth that you all know, but sometimes I don't think of it all the time, which is that values are really an inherent component of any kind of education system, whether it's formal or informal or relational as well. So we have a tremendous responsibility, if that's the case then, to have values-based education. And also in context of risk-taking, it's really shocking every time I say it to any audience. 10 years ago, when I served here earlier, it was very shocking to talk about how there can be really, really positive benefits from being part of a very global and interconnected world. And 30 years ago, when I first served here, it was kind of shocking when I talked about different ways of doing business and different ways of relating to one another, in particular ways in which you relate to one another on a more equal basis, a more egalitarian, and a more socially flat basis. Made people feel kind of uncomfortable then. 10 years ago when I talked about globalization, it made people feel a little bit uncomfortable. So this is about the newer way that I'm talking about discomfort, but I've tried to link it to global citizenship. So a couple of days, for example, I was in a really neat area, Mokpo, one of the provincial areas in the southwestern part of Korea, and was speaking to students at a middle school in a fairly isolated area. And the message to them was, even though they are in a rural area, they don't necessarily have all the advantages that would be readily apparent for equivalent kids in maybe Gangnam, in southern Seoul. They were already being prepared thanks to their teachers who had been through wonderful teacher training programs, thanks to Dr. Kim and his colleagues. But I just did stress so that the extra aspect of being able to have shock absorbers in your life and to actually be proud of things, of roads not taken, and things that didn't quite work out exactly the way they planned. Because ultimately it's only through micro failures and it's only through having a system that supports access to education, that supports the chance for people who might not have the same equal abilities that you can have success in society. So we focus on other areas as well. For example, one thing that I didn't mention was, as Korea is an aging society, so the education system is really trying to adapt and become much more flexible and endorse lifelong learning. There are other populations that have always been in Korea, just as they've always been in other societies, whether LGBT or physically challenged or perhaps mentally challenged. And by offering them equal access and a safe place to learn, they can actually increase the prosperity of Korea as a whole.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to touch upon the economic argument. I mean, it is good business to be more inclusive. I think we can all acknowledge that. With that in mind, if we could wrap up with Mr. Notz responding to how can we make transcending these challenges within the context of gender identity, how can we make that good business? Do you have examples which we can then translate into other contexts?
Okay, I want to raise one other issue. I will respond to your question, but there's actually a pamphlet in the exhibit hall at the moment, and it's about the Japanese textbooks. And the Japanese textbooks, the curriculum guidelines, state here, everyone is attracted to the opposite sex at puberty. Everyone. Well, that's not true for me, and it's not true from some other people that I could point to in this audience. So, and they change their textbooks apparently every 10 years in Japan. So this is the time that they could actually make an adaptation in their textbook to reflect reality, which is that not everybody is attracted to the opposite sex at puberty. And yes, when you have more diversity, and I'm not sure if I can point to a transgender model, but I just was listening to a webinar on NYU webinar courses, and they were talking about the lack of women in STEM, in technology. And they actually talked about when they designed the artificial heart, it was designed by men, and when they put these artificial hearts in women, it didn't work, it was too big. And if they'd had women as part of the design of the artificial heart, they might have adapted for that difference. And again, when I was doing what Robert was doing, and I was in the Foreign Service, I worked for the State Department, we had diversity classes, and we were taught over and over again, if we have greater diversity of opinion, the outcomes are better. And so when you have a lot of people at the table, men, women, black, white, gay, straight, you know, a lot of people at the table, and you can get different points of view, you avoid mistakes, and you get better outcomes. And you don't wind up with textbooks that says everybody's attracted to the opposite sex when clearly that's not true. So sign the petition and get the Japanese to change their textbooks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Notz. Obviously, a key thing there is that whole thing about dialogue, because if we increase dialogue, if we have education, we get that negotiation of ideas, then we can enhance global citizenship education. We have between 20 and 25 minutes left, and it would be good to hear some questions from the floor. Please keep them brief. Please address them to a specific individual, or if it's a generic one, that will be okay. We will try and think of who could answer. We're looking for questions, not statements. I'm afraid we don't have time for statements. So short questions. We'll have a round of 3 questions. These will be responded to, and then hopefully we'll have time for more rounds. So the first question, please. I understand you're meant to walk to a microphone. If you're near a microphone, please give the question.
Hello, my name is Myungsook Cho. I'd like to give a question to Ms. Bas. How can NGO cooperate with UN? This is my question.
Thank you. Very short and sweet question. We'll wait a moment. We'll get 2 more questions, and then we'll have answers. So another question, please.
Thank you. My name is Myungsook, and my question is about how can we overcome the cultural relativism in making the education for the global citizenship?
Thank you. And one more question?
Yeah, it's an honor to have a question. My name is Chaechun Gim from Korea University. I have a question to Ms. Myungsook Cho. I know you've tried to help and heal the young North Korean defectors from physiological shock by using a diverse curriculum such as art therapy. I want to hear the real stories. The first question is what the young North Korean defectors think about South Korea when they first arrive here in South Korea. And the second question is, what was or is the most difficult challenges you faced when you try to heal the young defectors from the heavy physiological shock? Thank you.
Thank you for those 3 questions. So, Ms. Bas, if you could respond to the first question on the NGO-UN cooperation.
Thank you. The United Nations has headquarters in all the 5 continents, what we call regions at the United Nations. One is, I think, in Thailand, right, UNESCAP. Another one is in Nairobi, Africa. Another one is in Santiago del Chile, Latin America. 2 are in Europe, Vienna and Geneva, and then New York, where I am based. I'm saying this so that everybody, depending on the region where you live, could get in touch directly with the headquarters of the United Nations offices in these regions to start with, in these continents to start with. When it comes to New York, and we have the major big gatherings of the United Nations Secretariat, we work mainly with non-governmental organizations that are accredited to ECOSOC. So they go through a process, they're cleared, and then they become accredited to the United Nations. Often these organizations, of non-governmental organizations, are big ones, have affiliates and branches all over the world. So you can, through them, have access to the United Nations if you are not accredited. And in that way, we can start having a collaboration. It's a very complicated world, the one of the United Nations, see? But I think that this would be the fastest way through NGOs that are already accredited to the UN. They will show you then the way. And then we can have events, conversations, debates, fora in the various regions or at the United Nations headquarters. We can interview you, we can release your interviews in our websites, in our newsletters. This is a way of collaborating together. We also provide technical service and technical cooperation and capacity building services by coming to you and sharing with you our knowledge so that you can keep sharing it with others. There are many mechanisms. These are some of the few.
Yes, certainly Mr. Knotts may want to add to that.
Well, taking it from an NGO perspective, and of course what Ms. Bas says about the UN, it is a complicated environment. But your relationship with the United Nations is a two-way street. One of it is talking to the United Nations and getting the United Nations to do what you want them to do as far as being an NGO. But probably a much more important direction is to take the SDGs, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals and other UN policies, and convince your governments to implement them. I mean, all the governments have signed on to the SDGs, but we know that they're not just going to automatically implement all of these things. So it's going to take civil society to push our governments to really truly implement these SDGs to the fullest. There were actually a lot of implementing mechanisms that were discussed during the process of formulating the SDGs, and some of those accountability mechanisms were stripped out by member states. They didn't want that much accountability. So how do we hold governments accountable? That's the NGOs, that's civil society going to our governments and say, okay, you signed, you agreed, you have a consensus agreement on these SDGs. When are you going to fulfill your obligations under Goal 4 for education and all of the other goals?
Thank
Thank you.
you. So the second question, though, is how to overcome cultural relativism in the context of global citizenship education. Do we have a volunteer to respond? Maybe Dr. Gim, you spoke about it. Would you like to respond?
Actually, I talk about community of identity should be replaced with community of difference. That means I think we have to tolerate the different cultures, even though you don't like the culture. That's the first stage of multicultural education, I think. The second stage is to positively approve the different cultures. But I think it's not easy to change people from negative to positive. But anyway, I think there's a second stage of multicultural education. And the last stage, I think we have to think about to make different cultures to be a better direction of human emancipation. I think if different cultures meet together and they talk a lot and they spend a long time together, then they can make, I think, kind of another new culture in which we can enjoy each other, where you can enjoy more freedom and more human dignity. I don't know whether we can make it or not, but I think that's the direction we have to pursue through this kind of meetings. Yeah, and thank you.
That's a very valuable aspiration. But I think you're pointing towards what Ms. Cho said earlier about turning anger into healing. I think anger is a pretty universal sentiment. So there are obviously values which we see across countries, energies which we can use for positive purposes. With that in mind, maybe Ms. Cho, you want to respond to the question related to what the young North Koreans think and what is difficult to change. How can you heal them?
예, 그 탈북 청소년들이 처음에 한국에 왔을 때는 본인이 한국에 와야 된다고 생각하는 아이들은 거의 없습니다. 부모에 의해서 비자발적으로 탈북했기 때문에 한국에 와서는 사실은 이제 한국인으로서의 정체성이 아직 없죠. 우리도 엄마 따라서 부모 따라서 미국에 이민 가면은 가자마자 내가 미국 사람이라고 생각하지 않지 않습니까? 그러면 살아가면서 정체성을 갖게 되는데 그 사이에 만약에 이곳에서 이제 적응하기 힘들고 자기가 배제되고 소외당하면 굉장히 분노가 쌓이게 되는 거죠. 게다가 같은 민족인데 누구는 이렇게 너무 어려운 과정을 겪어서 오고 여긴 너무 잘 살고 그랬을 때 분노가 굉장히 쌓이게 됩니다. 그리고 이제 그 인생에서 이렇게 나눠서 써야 될 에너지를 이제 한국에 입국하면서 다 써버려가지고 이 아이들이 굉장히 무기력증에 빠져 있는 부분도 있습니다. 이거는 다른 나라의 난민들하고도 같은 이런 특색이 있는데요. 근데 탈북자로서 더 있는 거는 뭐냐면 이 그 분노감이 좀 더 있는 것 같아요. 그리고 자존감이 굉장히 낮습니다. 그래서 북한에서의 어떤 교육의 어떤 결과물인 것 같은데요. 그 자존감이 낮아서 본인이 귀하다, 뭐 사랑받을 존재다 이런 거를 잘 모릅니다. 분노를 느끼는 것도 그런 부분들이 굉장히 컸어요. 그리고 이제 더 잘 살아보고자 하는 그런 것보다는 나는 그런 사람이야 이렇게 막 놔버리고 그리고 이제 그런 경우들이 많았는데 그럴 때는 저희들이 굉장히 밀착해서 끌어안아주고 또 이제 부모가 오히려 보호자로서의 역할을 못했기 때문에 무시하는 경우들도 있습니다. 그래서 부모의 짐을 좀 덜어주면서 부모를 이해시키고 그리고 더 중요한 것은 얼마나 본인이 소중한 존재인지를 끊임없이 계속 지속적으로 옆에서 알려줘야 되는 거죠. 그래서 이게 어떤 한순간의 캠페인이나 이벤트로는 안 되고 지속적인 교육으로서 계속 그렇게 해야 된다는 것이 있고 치유가 각종 이 아이들한테 어떤 아이들은 미술 치료가 맞고 근데 탈북자들은 거의 유물론에서 살았기 때문에 그냥 얘기하고 상담하는 것보다 자기 상태가 어떤지 눈으로 보는 게 굉장히 중요했습니다. 그래서 미술 치료나 이렇게 여러 가지 예술 치료들을 많이 해서 교육과 치료가 같이 들어가고 거기에다 보호도 같이 이제 들어가는 부분들이 아이들을 빨리 바꾸는 그런 방법이었습니다. 예.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very helpful approach. Mr. Knotts earlier came out with the statements about bullying. I think these all are connected. There's the anger inside young people. Maybe it's a lack of self-esteem, which is then projected to others. So part of education is addressing that, getting collective values which can lead to greater harmony. And now we have another round of questions. So if you'd like to address one of the panelists, I see a hand up over there. Please, could you go to the microphone?
Thank you very much for your presentation and for impacting extra knowledge to us. I am Ashi Anoma, KDI student. I want to know if at the level of the UN or the NGO, if there is a recovery mechanism for young girls who are driven out of their homes because of pregnancy, and to that effect, they have to drop out of school, and in the long run, the children they will give birth to will still not go to school. So we have like three problems. Family problem, the child who has to drop out of school because she has to give birth to a child, and this child which will come to life and will not go to school. So at the UN level or the NGO level, is there a recovery policy for such situations? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another question?
My name is Ann Wright. I'm from the United States, and I'd like to ask for a comment on how you teach global citizenship when we have political leaders who are using racist and biased terms and policies, really. And in particular, right now, we find in the United States that our political leaders are using racist and horrible statements about peoples from other parts of the world. And I know that's happened in other countries, but here in the United States now, we find that as one of our problems. Thank you.
Thank you. And a further question? It looks like we're going to have we'll have to be speeding them up, but if you could be short with your questions.
I'll try and make it short. This is addressed to Ms. Choudhury and Ms. Bas. I was really excited when you all were talking about alternate education, informal education. I work for a large community of adults with intellectual disabilities. And so we have found a solution But my question is it possible when you're looking at alternate communities, if you can give a little more focus to people, adults particularly with intellectual disabilities? Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question.
Thank you very much. Araya from KDI School. My question is to the Ambassador of Sierra Leone, as well as to Ms. Bas. Actually, we have possibilities to see some events in Africa, like they need to change the constitutions in order to stay in power. So do you believe that staying in power for a long time and adjusting the constitution helps us to improve the education access for Africa is my question. Second one is to Ms. Bas. Do we expect such sufficient fund to support education to address all the community who are interested to enjoy the benefit of school is my second question. Thank you very much.
I'll make it really quickly. I'm Becca Jung from Teachers Association. And I would like to ask UN, and I would like to ask some experience from Ms. Cho. Because when we are talking about the right, and especially we are talking on education and more focusing on global citizenship education, which is value-added point. So it's going to be really important to guarantee NGOs the financial sustainability. So how can you make it comparable to keeping their identity, talking on value-added issues, and then also guarantee the financial sustainability? Thank you.
Thank you. We may not be able to answer all questions. We'll do what we can. The first question, though, I think maybe Ms. Choudhury, would you like to talk about the young girls who are pregnant and then lack of access to education?
I have a question.
I'm afraid we don't have time. I'm terribly sorry.
Yes.
But we don't have time. Thank you. Would you like to answer, Ms. Choudhury, quickly on that question about the cycle of pregnancy and being out of school?
We have to work at 3 levels, actually at family level, because this is where the challenges start, because they are not accepted by the family and the societal level. And then institutional care, particularly at the school, where bullying, etc. might take place. But the more social stigma is there, then we have to work on educating or making aware the support structures that are being in place by the government, particularly health extension workers, those who work at that level. So this is institutional support and family support, both we need.
Thank you very much. The next question, I think, Mr. Ogden, could you respond to these tensions in terms of racial issues within the US and related matters? You didn't quite get the question.
I'm sorry, I was very foolishly chatting with Brewster. And what was the heart of your question? It's too hard for you to come back up?
In the meantime, I think we'll have to move on to the next question, which was about adults with disabilities. I think that was directed again to Ms. Choudhury and Ms. Bas. Maybe a very quick comment from each of you.
Marco, if you don't mind, I will just give you a generic answer, trying to cover as much ground as I can, and then later on I make myself available. Look, you have an example. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, my boss, he showed by example what education means. It means overcoming prejudices. It means trying to overcome stigma. It means try to change behavior of people. How do you do that? If you include everybody, if everybody has access to the United Nations, he decided, for instance, that he wanted to have a director, me, who is a woman, and we know how much Mr. Ban Ki-moon promotes gender balance with a disability, okay? So he showed by example that the system is inclusive, is accessible, and hopefully sustainable. Sustainable if they keep renewing my contract, but that's another story. So what I'm trying to say here is that even in your organizations, really try to have a diversified group of people, of people who you employ, indigenous people, persons with various kinds of disability, men and women, younger or older, it doesn't matter, so that we educate by really having an impact on including everybody. We show by example. The same applies to governments. Make sure as NGOs that at government level, at various levels, municipality, local, national, etc., all representatives of the society really fully participate in the decision-making actions, okay? So they can bring their voices higher up at international level and then lower down to the grassroots level through you NGOs. Make sure that you have representatives in your governments who have a disability, men and women, who are indigenous peoples, who are older and wiser maybe, or younger and wiser maybe. So let's make sure that we educate also our governments through you by changing their mindset, okay? So behavior at grassroots level needs to change to overcome stigma and prejudices and share, therefore, new ways of educating the society, not only through the formal means, as I said, and make sure that this will have an impact also at government level for governments to change their mindsets and utilize all kinds of media you have, from puppeteers in the countryside to the radio, television, any kind of media, social media, wherever there is internet, okay? They also shape the society. They allow us to have a conversation that goes from bottom and from bottom up. And media needs also to be trained and educated to change the terminology it uses and stereotypes and that they keep using by promoting wrong language or wrong. I'll give you an example. Often I hear bound to the wheelchair. No, the wheelchair gives me freedom to move. It doesn't bound me. So we really have to change mindset and to educate at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If I may just
it'll have to be very short,
very
short comments to help me wrap up.
I'll be very quick.
Madam
First,
Bas
Ms.
has
Choudhury, then Mr. Lotz.
already said most of the things with regard to intellectual or whatever form of disability. It's not only practice change, not only systems and structures, but policies. In many countries, there are policies which says that the education of the disabled is part of the mandate of the Ministry of Social Welfare, not the Ministry of Education. So there is a question of still welfare attitude to disabled people. It has to be under rights framework. That's it.
And last word here, a lot of the problems, all the problems that we're talking about could be solved with one word: money. We need to invest much more money in education. We starve our educational systems. We spend so much more money on so many other things, not nearly enough on education. If we paid our teachers enough, if we put enough money into infrastructure, and that's how this country got to where it is. It invested in its education system, it invested in its teachers, in its institutions, and in its students, and that's how it got the development that it earns today. And that's what every country around the world needs to do.
Thank you very much. Well, apologies that we have not had time to answer all questions. I think we've had a very stimulating discussion. It's brought forth a lot of emotion, a lot of energy. I hope this then is taken through to the rest of the conference. I would like to thank each and every one of the panelists, if we can give them a round of applause. Also, thank you very much to the organizers, and thanks to you, the audience.